Welcome everyone. My name is Jake Shackelford. I am a Patch My PC. I work over at Patch My PC as an engineer, and today we're going to go basically over just a normal demo routine that we do that covers the config manager side of things within the MEM space. So I'm going to switch what screen I am sharing here really quickly. 1 second. There we go. And again, feel free to use the chat if you have any questions at any point. Natalie Diller will be moderating it, and we will stop at a few different intervals to kind of go over some different things. But with that, got my new screen shared out here. Now, typically when we go through a demo, there's a couple things that I like to go over right off, the bat at the very beginning. And the first is that we do offer a full 30-day free trial of the product. So generally, when we're going through these things, I always recommend going out and grabbing that trial, because at the end of the day, until you've actually seen our product work within your environment, it really speaks for itself. And you can access that just from our website at patchmypc.com with the free trial button towards the top. Additionally, on our website, there is a section for the supported products that we currently support. You will have a nice search box here that you can type in whatever product you're looking for. Otherwise, you've got good old Control F in your browser, and you can search for whatever particular apps you're looking for. In the event an app is not in this list that you'd like to have added, you can simply hit this blue Request a New Product button, which will take you out to our ideas page, which is simply ideas.patchmypc.com. Works very similarly to how Microsoft User Voice used to work, and I stress used to, since Microsoft unfortunately got rid of it, but ours is here to stay. So in the event that there's an application or maybe a feature request for the publisher that you'd like to have added, you can come in here and request it. Additionally, from this page, you will see the second link will take you out to a public roadmap from us. So if you're ever curious to see, what are we working on internally, whether that's adding in new products, a bug that gets fixed, or maybe a new feature within the publisher, you'll be able to take a look right here and see what it is we're working on month to month. Now, having said all of that, any questions in the chat before we actually dive into the installation? And don't worry, I promise I don't bite. More than happy to talk about any questions anyone might have. All right, now it doesn't look like we have any, so we'll proceed with the installation. Now, on the config manager side of things, you will need to install this on your topmost software update point within the environment. Other than that, installation, very straightforward. It's going to be your standard next button. You've got your terms of service. We'll go ahead and accept those. There will be a checkbox at one point that asks, do you want to enable the Intune standalone mode version? In this case, we want the config manager side of things, so we're going to leave that unchecked for now. You're going to have your standard, select the installation folder location. We're going to leave that at the default, and we're just going to go ahead and hit install. And we'll give that a few seconds and then launch that right away. Now, the first thing you're going to see when you actually launch the publisher is going to be your general tab. Here, you're going to get some really basic information like your licensing information, what subscription level you're at, when it expires, your licensed device count. Directly below that is going to be your usage statistics. And I will say this section, not going to be the most valuable thing when you first start using the product. It's more of a, hey, 3, 6, 12 months have gone by since we've been using Patch My PC. Let's look back and see what they've actually done for us in that amount of time. The next section is every IT person's favorite thing, and that's going to be the certificate management portion. And I say that with absolute sarcasm because I know no one enjoys working with certificates. But with that in mind, there are 3 different options. The first, you can import your own PFX certificate. You can have Patch My PC generate a self-signed certificate for you, or we can go the easy route and just let Config Manager do all the work for us. In this case, I'm going to go the easy route. And to do that, we're going to head over into Config Manager, head down to Administration, expand out Site Configuration and Sites. We're going to right-click our primary here, go to Configure Site Components, and over to that software update point. From there, we're going to go to the third-party updates tab, and first thing that we're going to need to do is enable software updates. You'll notice by default, it wants to manually manage the certificate. In this case, I want config manager to manage the certificate. So I'm going to change this. You'll notice currently that we don't have any signing certificate details. I'm going to go ahead and hit apply, and we'll hit OK. From here, I'm going to actually go force a software update point sync to occur so that that certificate actually gets generated. And we can follow along by opening up the WSUS sync manager log while we wait for that certificate to get generated. It'll only take a few seconds here. There we go. Now, normally, when you're taking a look at a log, especially a config manager log, you see lines of red. It means something failed. In this particular case, it failed to find a WSUS signing certificate. But as a result, it's going to create and then insert a new one for us. So if we head back to that software update point configuration, we should see that there is some signing certificate details. There we go. We've got a WSUS publisher self-signed certificate. At this point, we can go back to the Patch My PC publisher and either restart the application or simply hit show certificate. And we'll now see, hey, we see that certificate. We've got matching thumbprints. We've got a green check mark here. We are, in essence, good to go. That right there is the hardest part of getting anything configured as far as Patch My PC is concerned. And as you saw, it took a matter of less than 3-4 minutes. Once you have that, we can start working on everything else. But we will come back to the general tab a little bit later because I do want to explore this Patch My PC log button. But before we talk about updates and ConfigMan apps, we're going to pop over to the Sync Schedule tab. So over on the Sync Schedule tab, you'll see that there's several different options when it comes to scheduling. The default value here is going to be daily at 7 p.m., plus or minus 5 minutes. You obviously have options here to change that. You could go weekly, the second Tuesday of every month if you want to do Patch Tuesday, monthly, hourly. You can even disable the sync if you'd like to. Essentially, what happens at this time is the publisher reaches out to Patch My PC, downloads the latest catalog, and then sees if there's any new updates or versions of applications available for the apps that you've selected. And if there are, it'll download and process those apps and updates at that time. Now, again, you're completely optional to change, whatever scheduling you like. I generally recommend leaving it the daily option just to make sure you're always getting the latest and greatest. But again, ultimately up to you on how often you want to have that sync. There will be an additional checkbox option at the very bottom that is off by default. This is, we can trigger a software update point sync whenever new third-party updates are published. The reason that this is an option is strictly for updates. When it comes to updates, we publish those updates into WSUS. Your software update point still needs to sync with WSUS in order to ingest all that information. So it really becomes a question of how fast do you want the updates to show within your configuration manager console. If the answer is immediately after the updates, you're probably going to want to have this checked off. Otherwise, you'll be waiting until your regularly scheduled software update points sync. Having said that, let's pop over into Config Manager and expand a couple different things out here. And let's start talking about updates and Config Manager apps. Now, before we talk about those two, I do like to make the distinction right off the bat that anything that's within this Updates tab corresponds with all software updates within inside of your Config Manager console, aka WSUS on the back end of things. Anything within the Config Manager Apps tab corresponds with actual application creation within the console. So you can think of things like the initial deployment of applications or uninstalling applications, or maybe you're referencing applications in a task sequence during OSD, different things like that. Just asking the chat out there, hopefully people are listening, but does that make sense for everyone? And again, feel free to ask any questions you've got out in the chat. If we have any questions that pop up, we'll answer them as we go. But with that, I guess we'll start on the update side of things. Now, before we start, picking all the different applications, going through this list, it's very extensive. There's over 600 different options. I like to go over on the right-hand side, and you'll see this little database icon. If I select this icon, and I simply type in the server name that's housing my Config Manager database, and the actual database name, and give me 1 second, I see that we've got a Q&A section. Yeah, Igor, we'll actually cover that once we get to the Config Manager apps side of things. There's actually an option for how we can handle all of that. But with that, back over to the actual scan here. Again, if we simply specify a server name that houses our Config Manager database and the actual database name. Oh, Andreas, let's allow you to talk here. You got a question? See a hand up? Nope, if not, we'll continue on. But again, simply typing that database name, assuming whatever user you're signed in has read access, we can hit query. And this, based on your active inventory from Config Manager, will show you all the different products that we could be patching for you. As an example, in this particular database, we found 286 applications, and I can filter this down by count. As an example, I can see, hey, I've got 34 machines out there with a 32-bit version of Slack, another 14 with the 32-bit version of GhostScript. And I can immediately just come in here and start checking these applications off, so I don't have to select them in that original list. Now, in this particular case, I'm going to leave those options unchecked, but know that this does exist. We're going to hit cancel for now, and it looks like we had another question here. Correct, you got it. So the question is, if I understand, updates are only to patch WSUS and the other tabs on applications is to manage updates on task sequences or OSD. Yes, so again, the updates tab is strictly the WSUS side of things, so just your normal updates, similar to Windows updates. And the Config Manager apps tab is going to be strictly for creating the actual initial applications. And we'll also keep those applications up to date for you as well. But back over on updates, you'll notice at the global level, at the all products level here, it says right click for customization options. If I give that a quick right click, there's several different options here. There's 3 that I really like to cover. The first is that we can delete desktop shortcuts created by the applications. If I select this, you notice that it's only going to affect 365 of the products, simply because either A, not every product creates a desktop icon, or B, natively supports the removal of it. Very similar scenario with disabling of the self-updater. It's only going to affect about 141 of the products. The one option that I ask everyone to please turn on is the manage installation logging option. With this, we'll do verbose logging for MSI installations and prefix the log with the computer name. What this option does is if the vendor supports logging, we'll pass that command in during the installation and export it on the local client device in that CCM logs path and then a new folder called patch my PC install logs. The reason I ask everyone to please turn this on is I'm sure you've probably seen plenty of Config Manager logs at this point. They can be incredibly helpful. At other times, they can give you the most generic error in the world that you're spending, a week trying to figure out what actually went wrong on that device. This log could be what makes or breaks figuring out what went wrong a lot simpler. So I always recommend turning it on at the global level. And we have another question in here. Let's see. Is it possible to modify application deploy like an application? Make Custo. I'm not sure if I understand that particular question, but essentially what it boils down to as far as like the deployment of any of this stuff, at the end of the day, all we're doing here from Patch My PC side of things is making this content available inside of your console. What you choose to do with it from a deployment perspective is completely up to you. So on the update side of things, maybe you want to manually create a software update group, or maybe you want to automate it and create an automatic deployment rule. On the app side of things, maybe you want to reference it in task sequences. Maybe you want to just do a standard, required or available deployment out to your users or devices. You'll have complete control over that, as they do just appear as any normal update or application would within inside of your console. With that, let's actually go down and grab an actual application this time. I'm going to go ahead and grab Google Chrome here, and I'm going to give that a right click. Now you'll notice at the individual application level, we've got a lot more options here. The first one is we can add custom pre and post scripts. So if you're familiar with writing PowerShell and you need something to happen either before or after that installation, you can write a script for it. As a really basic example, we have a script that sets the home page for Chrome based on some registry edits. Now, I'll be the first to admit that that is not the best way to set the home page for Chrome. But for the purposes of a demo, it works out nicely. You'll also notice a section below that for additional files and folders. This is great if there's any additional packages you want to include with that particular application. So as an example, maybe you have an application that requires a specific settings XML be included that's got some custom data in it. I always think of like the del command update application. Or maybe you have a licensing file as opposed to a key if you're still using things like WinZip and anything else like that. Again, anything that you'd like to include with that particular package, you'll be able to add here. For now, we're just going to add that PowerShell script and we'll hit OK. Now, at the top here, the second option is show package info. This is going to give you some really useful information, especially like where we're actually getting the downloadable media for this particular application. And in the case of Google Chrome, you'll notice it's coming straight from Google, the vendor, and we are grabbing that enterprise MSI variant. Additionally, you'll see the default command that we're using to do the installation. In this particular case, /qn for the silent installation, and then whatever the option is to suppress the reboot from happening. Now, since we're showing you the command line here, we also have a right-click option where you can actually modify the command line. And here you'll be able to add any additional arguments that you might have. So you can think of things like changing the language, the install directory, putting in a licensing key. Again, anything that the vendor would support here, you'll be able to pass in. Additionally, if it's an MSI-based app or an Adobe product, you will be able to add an MST transformation file. Simply browse out to that MST file or the CAD file that gets generated with it, and we'll include that for you. Most commonly used on the Adobe side of things. With that, I'm going to go ahead and apply, and we're going to jump down and grab Notepad++ as well. Now, Notepad++ is an app that I like to pick on, even though I use it daily. But if I give that a right click, you'll notice that there's some options here that are grayed out. So as an example, Notepad does not have a self-updater. It does have a very annoying prompt that'll tell you that it needs an update, but it never actually does anything for you. The vendor, unfortunately, does not have any logging, and it's an exe-based application, so no MST transformation file. Now, the other reason that I like to bring up Notepad++ is because we have a manage conflicting processes section. And this is essentially, if the application is running on the client device, when you push the update out to it, what do you want to have happen? The default for all the applications is just going to be perform the installation. And on 99% of the applications in our catalog, this works totally fine. For the other 1%, which Notepad happens to be a part of, you're going to want to use one of these three other options. Essentially, what happens with Notepad++ is if it's running and you push an update out to it, the registry will update. So for all intents and purposes, it looks like you are on that latest version of Notepad++. However, the binaries of the files do not. So you're technically on an older version. So again, with that in mind, we're going to want to use one of these three other options. The first one is auto close the conflicting application process before the installation. If you don't have maintenance windows in place within your organization, avoid this option, only because it'll lead to some pretty unhappy users. The second the policy hits that device, it's going to force that application shut and start performing its update. So with that in mind, you might not want to use that option. The next one is we can skip the installation when the conflicting process is in use. This one doesn't sound as bad. It'll just attempt to do the installation again during the next scan cycle. However, Notepad tends to be one of those applications that's always just running in your system tray. So you run the risk of it never actually wanting to perform the update. So generally, I recommend going with the last option, which is to notify the user to close the application. Now you'll notice when I select this, there are several different options that go inside with this. The first is going to be a default timeout of 300 seconds, or 5 minutes if you want to equate that into minutes. There is an option where we can prevent the end user from opening the application while the application is updating. Super useful for those click happy users that immediately try to open up the application the second it starts updating from potentially corrupting the install. That is an optional option. We give you the ability to override focus assist. Now, by default, it's going to be set to discard. I generally recommend leaving it at the discard option. The last thing you want to do is have a higher up giving a PowerPoint presentation and they get a notification for an update. You probably never hear the end of it. Nonetheless, every org is different, so we do have some additional options to override that behavior if you'd like to. Additionally, there is a user deferral policy. This is where the user can click a button in the pop-up that says, hey, I can't do this right now. Can we do it during the next scan cycle? Now, that's going to default to indefinitely. And in my experience, most users will always say, I can't do this right now. So I normally recommend switching this up to the up to option. And I'm just 1 second. We're taking a look over at the questions. Yes, Igor, on our website, we do have a list of apps that we should modify specifically with this manage conflicting processes section. And it's specifically a list for should these apps need to be closed in order for updates to be successful. And we can link that in the chat a little bit later as well. Natalie, I don't know if you have a chance to go. Actually, hold on 1 second. I've got this. This is why we have Stream Decks, correct? Let's grab this. I'm going to link this in the chat here. So the link that I'm posting here is a link to our known issues page. And on that page, the second section in that page is going to be the list that you're looking for. But with that list, again, you'll see Notepad++ is on there. We also list out why, or like what actually happens on why you need to add these options. But just again, know that exists. Now, back to the deferral policy options. Again, normally I recommend changing this to the up to option. Maybe changing this to 1 or 2 times, and beyond that, I'm sorry, but your application is going to get updated. Usually citing for security reasons is good enough for most people. But additionally, so if that timeout expired, no action is taken, so that 5 minutes goes by and the user doesn't do anything, what do you want to have happen? The default is we'll just defer the installation on behalf of the user. The second option is we'll close the application and perform the update. I'm a very big fan of the second option. I generally assume if you have not, been at your machine for 5 minutes, it's probably a good time to perform that update. But again, every org is different, so you've got the option there. You also have the option to say, you know what, I don't want to use a deferral policy. I want the user to get that pop-up and they can either close the app right then and there or wait the 5 minutes and it'll close it for you. In this case, I'm going to leave the allow the user deferral policy on, and we're going to jump into manage global settings here. This is where you can actually preview how that notification will appear. Now you'll notice this is kind of more of like a dark mode feature. If your users are using dark mode, they'll get this appearance. There's also a light mode appearance as well. But I can come in here and I can change things like, the organization name. I can set a custom banner. And you can have a little bit of fun with the banner too. It's kind of been a long running joke within the MEM community that we need GIFs in Software Center. Obviously, we don't have that. But we did, make sure that you could at least add a GIF to your, thumbnail or company logo here if you'd like to. But your users will then say, hey, Dunder Mifflin requires an app update for X application. Here's a list of all the applications that need to be closed as a result. And they can simply hit close all and update. It'll close those applications out and start doing the update. Or the user can obviously snooze at that point. Now, all of the text in here is also editable if you'd like to. Via the localization section. So you could come in here and add different languages or maybe English, and you can just change all of the text that's here. In this particular case, I'm going to leave it at the default. I'm just going to change the org name and the banner, and we're going to go ahead and hit OK. And we're going to hit OK here as well. Then we'll close this window out, and I'm going to hit apply. Now, I know we just talked about a lot of information in a very short period of time. Having said that, do we have any extra questions in the chat before we dive into ConfigMgr applications? And again, I promise I don't bite. So how do you deploy the updates? Well, we're going to get into that a little bit later, but essentially it's the same as you would any normal update from Microsoft. You can do it. You can manually create a software update group. You can create an automatic deployment rule. In our lab here, we have an automatic deployment rule, and that's generally how we recommend pushing out these updates to your machines. But it ultimately boils down to what's your deployment strategy, for regular Windows updates. And you can try to mirror that with the way we do updates here. But again, we'll dive into that a little bit later as well. With that, though, let's go ahead and enable our ConfigMgr apps here. And let's open up the options menu because there's a couple different things that we're going to need to configure. And I'll zoom in a little bit here because I know there's a lot to read. The first thing we need to configure is a source folder. Simply type in a UNC path and where you want the metadata for these applications to live. You can't really get much simpler than that. Other than that, though, there are some additional application creation options. The first 3 out of 6 are going to be on by default. That's where we can allow applications to be installed via task sequence action. We can allow clients to use distribution points from the site's default boundary group. We'll code sign the PowerShell detection method scripts using the WSUS signing certificate. So earlier, when we talked about those 3 different methods of creating the WSUS signing certificate, whichever one you decide to go with is the one that we'll use to code sign those detection method scripts. The next option could be a little bit wordy, but do not include the version in the application name, so the application name doesn't change after updates. Essentially, what happens when we create these applications by default, and I'm going to use Google Chrome as an example here, is they will show up inside of your console as Google Chrome version 11, version 100.4.4, whatever it is, by 64, and then MSI or XE if applicable. If you simply want them to just say Google Chrome by 64 on your console, you can check this off. Personally, I like leaving it unchecked, only because it is nice to go into your console and just immediately see the name of the version that you're on without diving into the properties of the application or adding an additional column into ConfigMgr. But again, personal preference here. We can move the applications to the following folder in the application node of the console. So if we go and look in ConfigMgr right now, you'll notice under applications, I have a subfolder for Patch My PC and a subfolder for 7-zip. In this particular case, I want all the applications that Patch My PC makes to go into that Patch My PC folder. Now, this is a global setting. I can change this at the individual application level, which we'll look at a little bit later. The last option here is when a new version of an application is released, we can delay the in-place application upgrade by X amount of days. So as an example, let's say Google Chrome comes out with an update. We will download that during the next scan cycle, and then we will wait 3 days before we actually publish that into your environment. Again, personal use case here. I like leaving it unchecked. I like having the latest and greatest whenever possible. But again, depending on your use cases, you might find that option useful. The next section is arguably the most important, and it kind of goes back to your question earlier, Igor, where you said, can you show how new versions of an application can be included in OSD task sequence? So the section is when a new application update is available, what do you want to have happen? The default is going to be the most automated approach, and that's where we can update the existing application's metadata. What does that necessarily mean? Let's say it's the first time that we've created an application for you. And once again, we're going to use Google Chrome here. So we created Google Chrome version 100. Then you went in and you went and referenced it in a task sequence action. Maybe you put out some required or available deployments for it, or maybe an uninstall, whatever option you decide to go with. And then let's say Google comes out with version 101. What'll happen is we'll actually just update that existing application. So we'll just rename the application, update the data behind it. That way that unique WID for that particular application remains the same, which means all those references, whether it's deployments or references and task sequences, also remain the same. They'll simply be pushing out the newest version of that particular application. Now, again, that's the most automated approach. It's the easiest approach if you want to just kind of be very hands off with everything, but it does not work in every environment. Some environments do have stricter change control. So with that in mind, there is also the option to create an entirely new application without modifying the previous one. Now, this does obviously require a lot more manual effort on your part, as you will have to go in, redo your deployments, redo your references and test sequences from time to time, do your internal testing. But obviously, depending on the type of environment you're in, you'll have to use an option like that. Now, you'll also notice there is a checkbox down here, which is retain up to X amount of the previously created applications. I always recommend setting this to at least 1. This way, you will retain a copy of the latest and greatest, as well as 1 copy of the previous version. That way, just in case, for whatever reason, if, as an example, the latest version of Chrome causes issues within your environment, you'll have a copy of that previous version that you'll be able to roll back to relatively pretty quickly. Whether you do something like a dependency change, supersedence, and uninstall the new, install of the old, there's obviously a million different routes that you can take to get to that point, but just know that you'll have an extra copy available. And you can obviously set that higher if you'd like to. 1 is usually the bare minimum that I recommend. The next option is we can delete applications even if they have a deployment. There are a few scenarios where this can come into play with the update existing application option, but it's realistically designed for the secondary option here. However, if you're using the create a new application approach, it's probably because you have stricter change control. So you probably aren't going to want to be deleting applications even if they have a deployment anyway. So generally, I recommend leaving that guy unchecked. The next section, content distribution. This is the easy section. Simply hit add distribution point group, select what distribution point group you want to push this information out to, and you'll be good to go. I do like to mention at this point, though, if you have a cloud management gateway, CMG, and you start pushing third-party updates to it, be careful because you will get hit with an egress cost on the Azure side of things. Essentially, what happens with a cloud management gateway when it comes to Microsoft updates is all cloud management gateway is doing is sending a KB article to your machines, and your machines are locally reaching out to Windows Update to grab that metadata and do the installation. So you're sending like just kilobytes of data. Anytime you put something that's third party or something that you've designed out on Cloud Management Gateway, you're now paying for the entire transport of that particular application to that device. And depending on how many devices you have and how much content you're pushing, it can get a little bit expensive. So just bear that in mind if you decide to push anything out on the Cloud Management Gateway. Do your testing. The last thing I want you to do is get a bill at the end of the month from Azure, and it's not what you expected it to be. But with that, we'll go ahead and close that out, zoom back out, make sure those settings stuck. Yep. We'll hit OK. We'll hit apply. Now, let's hypothetically say that we were on the updates tab and you had spent 2-3 hours going through painstakingly selecting all the different applications that you wanted. You did a whole bunch of right-click customizations, things like that. I'm sure you wouldn't want to do it again. So we do have a nice little copy button over here that'll copy all the selections that we made from the updates tab over to the ConfigMgr app side of things. So now if I scroll down, I see Google's already selected for me. And if I right click, all the options I had selected earlier are still there. If I go to my pre and post scripts, my script's still referenced for me as well. Now you'll also notice there are a lot more options when it comes to the application side of things. Most of these are going to be pretty self-explanatory. However, we'll still go through them. So as an example, we can manage categories. So if you have admin or user categories configured within your environment, you'll be able to add all that relevant information. You can manage security scope. So if you have proper RBAC set up within your environment, AKA only certain administrators can see certain things within inside of your environment, you can add those different security scopes. You can change the actual user experience. So if you wanted to do things like change login requirements, max, runtime, things like that, restart behavior, you've got full control to do that. Generally, I'm going to recommend leaving these at the default, but if you wanted to get a little, config crazy, you're more than welcome to. We also have the ability to move the application to a custom folder. Now, earlier, you'll notice to a custom folder. Now, earlier, you'll notice on the left-hand side there, I do have a subfolder for 7-zip. So I'm going to go ahead and grab 7-zip, and I'm going to tell this app that I want it to go into that subfolder specifically. And this will override that global setting that we set earlier. Additionally, you can set a custom application icon and change some of the properties around on that. Now, we do already populate all the icons for you. However, if you'd like to use your own personal one, you're more than welcome to. Yes, so anonymous attendee, is it possible to re-explain advice with CMG at the end? Absolutely, we can talk about CMG for as long as you want on that front. We'll definitely go over it again. And then the last option I'd like to talk about here is we can display as a featured application in the company portal. And yes, that does say company portal and not software center, because this option is specifically for co-management. So if you're doing co-management with Intune and you've got company portal pushed out and you want to make this as a featured application, you do have that option available. Now you're probably wondering, if you haven't looked at co-management too deeply, well, if you have co-management, you're doing applications, it only listens to Intune. The application slider is the only slider in co-management that actually works a little bit differently than anything else. So if you push out applications from ConfigMgr and you have that slider over on Intune, your devices, assuming they have the ConfigMgr client, can still get applications from ConfigMgr. Those show up inside of Software Center as well as Company Portal. So just a fun little, tidbit there. The rest of the options in here, you realistically won't have to worry about. They're more for the support side of things. So if you ever run into an issue, we can run you through how those options work. In this case, though, I'm going to just go ahead and hit apply. And we're going to jump over to the sync schedule tab and force a sync to occur, because I'm sure you don't want to stay on the phone until 7 p.m. local time on the server runs around. So we'll force that sync to occur. And now we're going to jump back to that general tab. And we're going to open up that patch my PC log that I had briefly mentioned that we'd come back to. This is the log that you're going to want to take a look at if you want to see everything that's actually happening in the background while it's doing its sync. So as an example, we can see that it's processing an update 1 out of 2 for Google Chrome. It's grabbing the script that we had referenced earlier, and now it's calling the WSUS API to publish that information. So again, if you were ever curious to see what's actually happening under the hood, or maybe there's an error that's happening, this is the log to take a look at. Now, watching this log can also be like watching paint dry, especially when we get to the step where it's calling the WSUS API, because I'm sure plenty of you are aware WSUS is incredibly slow. So while that's going off, we'll actually dive over into one of the other tabs here, and that's going to be our alerts tab. So there are 3 ways for us to notify you whenever there's been a change inside of your environment, aka we publish new applications or updates. The first is going to be an SMTP option, so basic email message. The next 2 are going to be Teams or Slack webhook notifications. I am a very big fan of the Teams option. It takes less than 5 minutes to get going, but if you were to enable that, you would get things like this. So you can see as an example, hey, we created an application for VLC Media Player. Oh, and look at that. We created one for the driver automation tool as well. You'll get a link out to the release notes page. So if you want to actually see what changed in that particular version or what's new, you'll be able to do that, as well as size, severity, and classification. Now, in the event, if I scroll up here, we should be able to see some. In the event that any of the applications include CVEs, we will include those and also hyperlink out to their respective CVE website. Google Chrome and Adobe products being the biggest offenders there. But just a great way to kind of keep track of anything that's going on within your environment. Now, you'll also notice down here in the notifications section, the level is set to all. If I double click this, I can actually change the notification level. And you'll notice there's an error level here. So we're also going to report if there's any errors or anything fails during the initial sync. And if there is a failure, you'll generally get a notification on why it failed, as well as a KB article on how to potentially fix that. Now, obviously, at that point, you can just reach out to support. We're more than happy to help you with that. But generally, those KB articles will tell you exactly what's going on. Let's see. So we got another question here. So basically, if you distribute apps/updates to CMG, you will generate a lot of egress traffic towards your clients and you're paying for all that traffic. So yes, that nails it exactly on the head. You pushing the updates to the cloud management gateway doesn't cost you a penny. But the second your clients start reaching out to the cloud management gateway to grab that content and pull it down, that's when you start paying that cost. Now, it's not insanely expensive, but again, depending on how much data and how many clients you're pushing, you might end up with a higher bill at the end of the month than you were necessarily expecting. But with that, let's take a look. It looks like our log finished up, so we're going to go ahead and close that. Let's actually dive into the config manager side of things. And if I refresh, let me move this over a little bit. If I refresh my 7-zip folder here, you'll see that we've got 7-zip. And in the patch my PC folder, we've now got Google Chrome and Notepad. If I actually dive into the properties of these applications, you'll notice, especially on the Software Center tab, that we do try to populate as much of this information as we possibly can. Especially the user documentation, the privacy URL, the description, and the logo being the big one. That way, if you ever make these applications available to your users via Software Center for their, self-service installation, they'll have a relatively good time trying to decide what they might want to install. I will say most users I know will just immediately see the logo and hit install without reading anything. But for those more curious users, you'll have all that extra information. Now I'm going to run a quick script in the background that's going to deploy all 3 of those applications out as available to a client device. And while that's going off, we're going to jump into updates because we will look at a client device right after this. But in the all software updates section, where I would normally find all of my normal Windows updates, you'll notice, here is Google Chrome and Notepad, available as updates as well. Now, again, I want to stress that at the end of the day, all Patch My PC does is make this content available inside of your console. What you choose to do with it from that deployment perspective is completely up to you. So in this case, you're going to notice that downloaded and is deployed is already set to yes. And that's because we do have an automatic deployment rule. So again, if you wanted to, you can handcraft, your individual software update groups or individually deploy out a particular update. But generally, we're all about automation here. So we recommend going the automatic deployment rule route. Now, the actual rule is very straightforward. There's just 2 rules here. And if we go into the software update section, it's going to be superseded and vendor. Simply having no and Patch My PC is all you need. We'll hit preview, and that's going to bring up all the third-party applications that you published for Patch My PC. Now, this is also where you can configure the deployment of those that particular rule. So as an example, you'll see I have 3 separate deployments. I have 2 pilot groups, one with a 1-day delay or a deadline, one with a 3-day, and then I push everything out into production 7 days later. Now, again, this is an example. You can do this however you'd like within your environment. Just know that you have full control over it. With that, though, we're going to dive over into an actual client device because, seeing all this on the server side and seeing it in your console looks great, but what about the actual end user experience? So we'll take a look and see what that looks like. And we'll give this a second because it likes to boot up a whole bunch of different stuff. Make that a little bit smaller. And it's thinking. I'm going to try reconnecting to it here really quick. There we go. So within programs and features, you'll notice I have a very old version of Chrome, version 81. Also an older version of Notepad. Over in Software Center, I've got those 3 applications that I made available. And in the update section, I've got Google Chrome and Notepad. Now I'm going to go ahead and process the update for Google Chrome here. It is a slightly newer version, still not the most recent, but we're going to process that. And if you remember, we told us to get rid of the desktop icon, turn logging on, disable the self-updater, as well as run that PostScript for us to change the home page. So right there, you just saw that we had this log folder pop up, and there's going to be your verbose MSI log. Now, hopefully, you'll never have to take a look at this log, but in the event of an error, it is nice to know that it exists. There is another log that gets generated as well, and that's going to be the Patch My PC script runner log. Now, you're probably wondering, well, what is script runner? Well, script runner is something that gets bundled with all these different updates, and it's basically the wrapper that allows us to do all this different customization. So you can think of, if we take a look at this log, you'll be able to see everything that happens during the installation, the second the download starts, the second the installation finishes. So as an example, I can see, it's calling the Chrome MSI Enterprise, installer here. It's passing in some different arguments. Here's the reference to that post command to run that script. Here's some registry changes based on some of those right-click options that we did, some logging paths, different things like that. And then if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, we'll see that we had an exit code of 0, which means that the installation was successful. The icon on the desktop is gone. If I refresh my programs and features here, we're on that 97 version. And if I actually launch Chrome, we should see that it did change the home page for us. Now, in this case, it just redirects to our particular website, but that script did indeed run. Now, we also have Notepad++ available as an update. Now, you'll notice I have Notepad++ open. So once I hit install here, we should get that nice little, notification prompt that Dunder Mifflin requires an update. There we go. And it says, hey, Dunder Mifflin requires an update for Notepad++. Here's the countdown timer for your user, as well as a list of all the applications that are going to be closed as a result. In this case, I'm going to just go ahead and hit close all and update. It's going to force that application shut, start the installation, get rid of the desktop icon based on that right-click option, and we're in business since Notepad installs so fast. And we give a quick refresh here, and we're on that 8.2 version. So at the end of the day, everything functions exactly as you'd expect it to on the client side of things, but it is still nice to actually see it panning out based on the options that you had selected. But with that, we're going to jump back over to the server side of things because there's just a few other things that I like to cover. That's kind of the core of the product, but there are some additional options. So as an example, we actually make a public Power BI dashboard report available. We also have some SSRS dashboard reports as well. Now, both the Power BI dashboard and the SSRS dashboard reports are completely open to the public. They're on our website. You don't have to pay or anything like that to get these, but they can give you some additional information. Now, generally, it is the year 2022. I recommend going with the Power BI report only because SSRS is a little bit dated at this point, but you do get 15 different dashboard reports with that. And some are going to be, geared towards just generic software updates. Some are going to be more towards third party. It really depends what you're looking for. But if you want to have some, deeper insight and really be able to give management, like, here's the actual numbers, here's what our compliance is looking like, these reports could definitely come in handy. But other than that, that covers the core of the Patch My PC product. Obviously, we also cover Intune now as well. If you want a demo on that, strongly encourage booking one. But once you understand the ConfigMgr piece, the Intune side, very simplistic. But other than that, I'll open it up to any questions anyone might have. Feel free to use the Q&A or the chat specifically. And Igor, you know what? That brings up a good point. So you're saying, thanks for the full review. Sadly, I now am aware our Patch My PC is heavily under-configured. What you can actually do, let me get you a link here, assuming my Google skills are with me today. You can actually schedule an environmental review with us. It's a 30-minute meeting, but basically we can go through your entire configuration, maybe give you some suggestions. I'm going to link this in the chat here. Yep, James, I can get you the link for those. James was asking for the links to the reports. Should have sent that there. Now, we also, like I mentioned, have the Power BI dashboard reports. And those, let's grab from our YouTube channel, because Jordan actually had a fantastic video on how to get that all configured, like a step-by-step guide. There we go. I'm going to link that in the chat as well. Anyone else with questions? Again, happy to answer anything. Like maybe you want to know pricing, more information on a different particular aspect. Happy to go over whatever. So Shane Connor asks, what's the best way to be notified when new applications are added to the catalog? There is an email list that you can sign up for, as well as an RSS dashboard feed that'll tell you like when we add new applications to the catalog. Natalie, I don't know if you want to grab the link for that and send that over. But between the RSS dashboard report and the email report that we can send out to you, those are going to be the best ways to find out when we add new things, especially if you're trying to figure out, what new apps are we adding? Because we do try to average about 5 new applications that weren't in the catalog previously a month. Some months we can definitely get in a lot more, but 5 right now is about the average that we like to go to. So James asks, are any vendors making progress with the SSLS TLS failures? And for those who are unaware, recently, a lot of vendors have been switching the ciphers that they've been using in order to allow downloads on different websites. And as an example, older server architectures like Server 2012 and sometimes 2016 don't natively have those ciphers installed in them, and there's no way for you to manually install them. So the only real option is to update to those newer versions or of Server OS. For some of those, we have found a workaround of just changing the actual like download link to like an HTTPS link or different things that they have available. But as it stands right now, there's not a whole lot that we can do to kind of shift that around. Like, so TechSmith, as an example, that they do Camtasia and Snagit. We've reached out to them a couple of times, basically asking, like, hey, can you add these older ciphers back in? And in some cases, the vendor's been very like, no, we're not doing that, which to a sense makes sense. You don't want to go back in time. But there hasn't been a ton of pushback from the vendors that have been like a positive, like, oh yeah, we could add that back. Hope that answers your question, James. Absolutely. And obviously, if any questions come up later in the day, we will be at the booth answering questions throughout the day if people have anything. Otherwise, feel free to shoot an email over to support@patchmypc.com, and we can talk over whatever questions, comments, or concerns you might have. But other than that, I thank everyone for your time, and have a great rest of your day.